There are a lot of factors that influence what we believe about what it means to be a survivor of childhood sexual trauma, both us as individual survivors and for society as a whole. And what we end up believing has a really significant impact in a lot of ways. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I'd like to encourage you to take a moment and consider, maybe even pause this. When you think about what it means to be a survivor of childhood trauma, so when you picture somebody who's experienced childhood trauma, let's say somebody in their 40s who experienced childhood trauma, what comes to mind? Now, don't overthink it. Just what immediately comes to mind. Maybe there's an image that you've seen already and that comes to mind. It might be an idea about who they are. It could be a word or a phrase that comes to mind. It could be a combination of things. But just give yourself a moment and think about what comes to mind. So, if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you have some pretty good understanding around what it means to be a survivor of sexual trauma. But the majority of the population doesn't. But even for some of you, what might have come to mind, and certainly for people that don't have a history of trauma, certainly people that are probably over the age of 20-ish years old, and especially the older you are, the more this would be the case. So often, and it's gotten better gradually, but we are still a long way from where it needs to be. Whether it's in movies, television, even music to a degree, just because it's not in music a whole lot, and even in news media, there is this idea, this image, this stereotype really, that continues to be depicted, perpetuated about survivors of childhood trauma. And one of those is that they're all female. Now, the majority are female, but males are so often missed in conversations around childhood sexual trauma. So that's one thing that is problematic. But so it's women, and so often, so incredibly often, it is a woman who is portrayed as being really unstable, suicidal, homicidal, can't maintain a relationship, can't hold down a job, can't get out of bed, has just a lot of really unhealthy behaviors, like extreme unhealthy behaviors. And certainly that can happen, without a doubt. I think it's also important to recognize that that can happen for people that have never experienced sexual trauma. There's no shame around struggling in that way, regardless of your history. But the reality is that that is not the majority of people that have experienced sexual trauma. It just isn't. Now, for some people, there may be periods of time that it can get that bad, but it doesn't typically, that is not the entirety of your life, generally speaking. Again, no shame if that is the reality. And what factors go into whether somebody responds and struggles in that way versus some other way? There's a lot of factors that go into that. And even two people that have similar experiences, relatively similar upbringings, there can still be vast differences because everybody's life is different. The people you're surrounded by are different. The things you're exposed to are different. So any one thing can push somebody in a very different direction. And it's never going to be likely just one thing. There's a lot of things that impact that. So the problem with this kind of stereotypical depiction is that it reinforces shame. It reinforces a sense of hopelessness that if I've experienced childhood sexual trauma, I can never expect to feel happy, to be healthy, to have a good relationship, to have a life that feels meaningful. I just have to learn to deal with this because, as society suggests and movies suggest, broken and damaged. Now, I do know that with particularly social media and more people talking about it, that is shifting a bit, but it's not shifting enough because there's not enough conversation around the whole topic. So that's part of what we're doing today. So it creates all of those things for survivors because we're already feeling scared and shameful and fearful about the future. We already feel responsible for what happened. So our sense of having a good life is fairly non-existent. Now, for some people, part of their way of coping might be, as children, might be, I can't wait to get out of here. I'm going to leave this place and I'm never going to look back. And they go on and live their life. That is part of coping in a sense. Now, that's not a bad or a good thing necessarily either. It just is the reality. Other people cope by just accepting, like, okay, this is just the way it's going to be, so there's nothing I can do about it. One isn't necessarily better than the other. Now, in society's view, one is better than the other, but that's because of how we tend to view what is good and bad, right? So, because one of the things that I think is important here is that no matter where you fall on that spectrum of what your struggle looks like, it's still struggle. And numbing and avoiding by doing things that society views as not so good versus numbing and avoiding doing things that society views as good isn't really better, right? It's still numbing and avoiding. It's still keeping you from being able to heal. It's likely still keeping you from being able to really feel connected and engaged with people that matter to you. It's likely keeping you feeling that you're unworthy. And that, I think, is a really important thing for everybody to be able to recognize, because we often tend to look at people who fit society's standards of what like success looks like, right? And for most people watching this, where you live, there's a good chance that part of that is career and financial status and relationship status, where you live, how you spend your time, all of those types of things. And I think most people now know, but I know that I have worked with enough people to know that those things do not make anybody happier than not having those things. And what's interesting is that sometimes, and I've had this happen with people I have worked with, sometimes having those things that society views as success, when you are struggling with self-worth and shame and all the things that go along with being a survivor, it's almost as if it gives you another layer or 10 of shame, because you think, because you grew up in the same society, so you end up believing oftentimes that I should feel better, I should be happier, I have all these things, why am I not feeling okay? Why can't I just be in a relationship? Why can't I be happy at work? Why can't I just do this thing that I know I should do? Why can't I just be grateful? So that can add additional layers of shame and even fear that people have, which can keep them then from like almost even more fear around anybody like finding out that they have this history. And that can create a lot of difficulty as well. So I think it's really important to recognize that survivors can look every way. Whether it's about color, whether it's about size or gender or non-gender, whether you look what society would describe as attractive or not, whether you're older or younger, none of that matters. All of us, every single one of us, has the potential that we are a survivor without anybody else knowing it, or without the people around us necessarily knowing it unless we have shared it with them. Meaning that there's no sign, as much as we think that there is, especially as children oftentimes, that people can just sense it or they would know it, kind of like the scarlet letter. People don't know. People aren't aware. And sometimes the way our lives look can be a mask, in a sense, a facade, so that people don't learn. And so then there can be a lot of fear around that mask slipping and people finding out. So if we can recognize, again, as survivors and society as a whole, that literally anybody around us may be a survivor, male or female. Anybody around us may be a survivor. So when we find ourselves comparing ourselves to the people around us, recognizing that the ideas that we have about who they are and what their life looks and feels like may not be accurate. Because when we make those comparisons, it often leaves us feeling less than, less deserving, less worthy. And there are people on all ends of all parts of the spectrum of what society views as successful. Again, whether it's relationship status, financial status, whatever it is, religious status, all over the spectrum, that many people would not have any idea because they don't fit that stereotypical mode. So I know that this has happened, and I'm using myself as an example because I have personal experience with this. People have said to me, actually, when I have seen people in person, not as much online because people often get to know me first here, so they know a little bit more about my story. But people have shared with me things at times suggesting, really not just suggesting, but believing that I had never been abused, that I grew up in a two-parent, middle-income household and went from high school to college, that I've never struggled with anything, that I didn't know what it would feel like to feel on the outside of something. Like those kinds of things people have actually said to me. And I've always been pretty surprised by that, especially early on, because the assumption that they made, what they believed about who I was so inaccurate. Kind of really the opposite of what my life actually was. And having that happen more than a few times, it really helped me recognize just how easy it is for us to be able to do that and then set ourselves apart from other people. Now, I will fully acknowledge that part of the reason that that has happened is because people think that, well, if I have become a therapist, then clearly I have my act together and I don't struggle with anything. Well, that certainly is not the reality. I struggled with a lot and still sometimes don't feel like I have my act together. But the assumption is there. And in that assumption, feeling separate from, feeling like people could never understand. And maybe they can't, but I think there are a lot more people that could understand than we realize. And I have worked with people across the spectrum of what a life can look like. From people that are in that stereotypical place, more so when I worked in nonprofit, to people that are to look at, whether it's career, financial status, how their Instagram worthy life might look, that people would never know not only what they've experienced in their life, but what they continue to experience in their lives, the struggle that is still there. And I think that that can be important, because when we're making those comparisons and we think, well, if that person's a therapist, then they must not ever struggle. Not true. Well, that person is a politician, they must never struggle. Absolutely not true. Look at doctors, nurses, higher education administrators or professors, lawyer, and I have worked with these people, so I can say that without any doubt whatsoever. So often, if they haven't gone through the healing journey, so many of the same things that you struggle with, and whether you fit into those categories or not, some of those same things that you struggle with, they also struggle with. So your doctor, your lawyer, your auto mechanic, your best friend, your neighbor, your child's teacher. Survivors are everywhere, in every place in society. And when we recognize that we are all in this together, that we all struggle in our own ways, and even for people whose lives look perfect on the outside, that there are days that they may not be able to get out of bed. And recognizing that, really being able to understand that, so that when you are making those comparisons and thinking that you're just not strong enough, that you're not determined enough, that you're not deserving enough to get where they are, that isn't the reality. There are so many factors that influence that, and for so many people who do have those more kind of what society views as successful types of lives and careers, sometimes that is a result of the push for things to be perfect, to move away, far away from the life that they knew. Sometimes it's even about expectations in their family. And of course, being able to succeed at something in your life that you set out to do, that is a good thing, and that is something to feel good about. But I've even had people who are in those places and look at other people in similar situations, even if it's somebody who is a mom and they feel like they're struggling with being a mom, and their children are going to be damaged because they can't get their act together. They'll look at another mom and think that mom is so much better, not knowing that another day that week I'm going to see that same mom who struggles in much of the same ways, and is maybe comparing themselves to the mom sitting in my office at that particular time. And I have had something similar to that happen before. They did not know one another, but similar types of things. And so part of just kind of eliminating the shame and stigma, I think, is recognizing that struggle when it comes to being a survivor is normal. And no matter where we are on a spectrum of how we struggle and what that looks like, there are people that are right there in the same place with us, and there are people at different points of that spectrum who are also comparing themselves. Because we all struggle, and if we have not yet been able to go through the process of healing, no matter what our lives look like, there is struggle. The struggle may look different, because addiction, like with substances, looks quite different than perfectionism, for example, or OCD, right? They look different. One's a little bit more acceptable from society, but they can both develop as a result of avoidance and numbing. So next time you find yourself comparing, make sure to think about that. Thank you very much for being here. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. First, what came to mind when you let yourself just kind of think about what it means to be a survivor, and also anything else that came up for you. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. And if you found this helpful, give it a thumbs up. Thanks so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.